On the cold morning of November 3rd, 2022, the town of Ridgewood, Oregon, a quiet community nestled in the shadows of tall evergreens and surrounded by rolling fog, awoke to an unsettling discovery that shattered its sense of peace. At 7:15 a.m., just as the first week light of dawn crept across Silver Pine Lake, a local fisherman, Tom Jensen, trudged down the well-worn path to his favorite fishing spot. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the faint scent of moss and stagnant water, as his boots squelched softly against the muddy ground. Tom had been coming to this spot for years, drawn by its tranquility, but that morning something caught his eye. A white BMW sedan parked awkwardly near the tree line, its pristine surface streaked with grime and wet leaves. The vehicle was partially hidden, as though someone had hastily tried to obscure it with fallen branches. But it was clear to Tom that the car didn't belong there. Ridgewood wasn't the kind of place where cars were left abandoned in the woods. As he approached cautiously, clutching his tackle box, Tom noticed the driver's side door ajar. The door's edge hung open like a gaping mouth, and something in Tom's gut told him to turn back. But curiosity, or perhaps a growing sense of dread, compelled him forward. He peered through the windshield, his breath fogging the glass, and froze. Inside, a young woman's body was slumped awkwardly over the center console, her upper body pitched forward. Her face, partially obscured by dark strands of hair, was turned slightly toward the passenger seat, her expression eerily serene. She was wearing what appeared to be a black dress, elegant but rumpled, the hem brushing against her knees. Her makeup, still mostly intact, smeared faintly under her eyes, as though she had been crying or wiping away tears. Her lipstick, a deep red, was faintly smudged at the corner of her mouth, and her skin, pale as porcelain, stood in stark contrast to the dark leather interior of the car. But it wasn't just her appearance that struck Tom. It was the details, the faint bruises circling her wrists, like fingerprints pressed too hard into her skin. The small scratches across her palms and knuckles, as though she had clawed at something or someone in her final moments. And then there was the gash above her temple, a deep but clean wound that had long since stopped bleeding. On the floor beneath the passenger seat, the shattered remains of a smartphone lay glinting faintly in the dim light. The screen was spiderwebbed with cracks, and it looked as though it had been smashed deliberately. Anger, Tom thought, or panic. Tom stumbled back from the car, his heart hammering in his chest. He fumbled for his phone and dialed 911, his voice trembling as he relayed what he had found. Within 1 hour, the Ridgewood Police Department arrived, led by seasoned investigator Detective Maria Dawson. The scene was immediately roped off, yellow tape fluttering in the faint wind as officers combed the area for clues. Photographers captured every angle: the ajar door, the discarded phone, the small droplets of dried blood staining the console near Sienna's body. The victim was quickly identified as Sienna Blake, a 29-year-old newcomer to Ridgewood who had arrived just a few months earlier. In life, Sienna had been somewhat of an enigma. She was beautiful, with the kind of presence that lingered long after she left the room, and yet she had remained a stranger to most of the locals. Her glamorous lifestyle, evident on her Instagram, which boasted 40,000 followers, seemed incongruous with the sleepy town she had chosen to call home. On social media, Sienna's life appeared perfect. Sunlit photos of exotic beaches, luxurious meals, and designer outfits taken in pristine lighting. She posted carefully curated captions about ambition, success, and the beauty of life, always appearing confident and content. Yet no one in Ridgewood could explain why she had chosen their small town, far from the glamour she seemed to crave. Sienna had rented a modern loft apartment in Ridgewood's revitalized downtown area and kept mostly to herself, save for the occasional appearance at the local coffee shop or bookstore. Those who had crossed paths with her described her as kind but distant, polite but guarded. It was clear she was not here to make friends. To some, Sienna was intriguing. To others, she was a puzzle that didn't quite fit. And now she was a murder victim, leaving the town shaken and Detective Dawson with more questions than answers. The forensic team worked quickly, documenting the scene. Dawson noted the placement of the car, hidden just enough to suggest intent, yet carelessly so, as if the perpetrator had fled in a panic. The open door, the shattered phone, and the bruises spoke of a struggle. But there were no signs of a prolonged fight. The autopsy, completed later that day, confirmed the cause of death. Blunt force trauma to the temple, likely caused by a single, well-aimed blow. Yet something about the injuries troubled the coroner. While the head wound was fatal, there were no indications of defensive wounds, no fractured nails, no deep scratches on her attacker. It was as though Sienna had not seen the blow coming or had not resisted when it happened. This detail disturbed Dawson. It spoke not of a chaotic fight, but of something more deliberate, a calculated act of violence. As the investigation began to peel back the layers of Sienna's life, Detective Dawson and her team would uncover a truth far darker than they had imagined. Behind the curated photos and polished smiles lay a woman entangled in secrets and deception, and a town about to realize that some masks hide monsters lurking in plain sight. Ryan Morgan had always been a man who existed in the margins. At 35 years old, he was the textbook definition of reliable, punctual, diligent, and methodical to the point of monotony. A financial advisor at the Ridgewood branch of a regional bank, Ryan spent his days immersed in balance sheets, client portfolios, and investment projections. His co-workers trusted him without question, but no one really knew him. He was the man who stayed late without complaint, who showed up early and prepared for meetings, and who always offered polite nods of agreement during office chatter, without contributing anything of his own. Ryan's life was carefully constructed, each day fitting into the next like pieces of a puzzle, with no empty spaces. He woke at 6 a.m. sharp, brewed his coffee black, 1 teaspoon of sugar, only on weekends, and scanned the markets while the rest of the town still slept. His gray sedan carried him the same route to work every morning, right on schedule, and his evenings were a mirror image of predictability. A solitary dinner in his spotless one-bedroom condo, usually delivered from one of 3 rotating takeout spots. Then an hour at the gym, followed by time spent reading financial news or catching a few minutes of cable television before lights out at exactly 10:30 p.m. To most people, Ryan was unremarkable. He wasn't disliked, but he wasn't particularly liked either. His quiet demeanor gave the impression of someone content with solitude. When Ryan first met Sienna, she seemed to step out of a world entirely different from his own. He had seen her at the corporate mixer, standing effortlessly radiant in the middle of the room. Her green dress shimmered under the chandeliers, and her laughter carried through the hum of forced small talk. Ryan hadn't intended to approach her. He never did in rooms like that. But Sienna had noticed him in the corner, clutching his drink like a lifeline, and crossed the room herself. For the first time in years, Ryan felt seen. Sienna's energy was magnetic, her charm disarming. Where Ryan saw uncertainty, Sienna saw adventure. Where Ryan lived within boundaries, Sienna drifted over them, unconcerned with the rules. And while she brought color and chaos to his life, Ryan offered her the steadiness she claimed she needed. To everyone else, they were an unlikely pair, the reserved financial advisor and the glamorous newcomer whose life seemed to exist entirely on Instagram. But Ryan didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt like a participant rather than a spectator. Yet, as their relationship deepened, so did the doubts. It began as small things: missed calls, half explanations about late nights, vague mentions of business opportunities. Sienna's stories didn't always add up, but Ryan pushed the discomfort aside, convincing himself that his suspicions were products of his own insecurity. Now, with Sienna dead, the spotlight turned quickly and mercilessly to Ryan. He was the boyfriend, the closest person to the victim, the one with the most to lose. His quiet demeanor, once seen as an endearing quirk, became the subject of scrutiny. His shaky alibi, an evening spent driving to clear his head after an argument with Sienna, did him no favors. Detective Maria Dawson had seen men like Ryan before, reserved, tightly wound, and seemingly harmless, until something snapped. On paper, Ryan fit the profile of someone who could commit an act of passion. The repressed boyfriend, betrayed or pushed too far. The bruises on Sienna's wrists and the smashed phone hinted at a confrontation that had spiraled. Yet something about Ryan didn't sit right with Dawson. He was emotionally unstable, yes, but his confusion and sorrow felt genuine. If he had killed Sienna, Dawson thought, he wasn't the type to hide it well. And so she kept digging, turning her focus toward the details of Sienna's life, where darker secrets were waiting to be uncovered. For Ryan, the walls began to close in. He wasn't just mourning Sienna, he was fighting for his innocence, his carefully controlled life crumbling around him. The woman he thought he knew had been hiding far more than he could have imagined. And the town of Ridgewood was about to learn just how deadly those secrets had become. Sienna Blake was a woman who didn't just enter a room. She owned it. She was the kind of person people noticed without being able to pinpoint why. Maybe it was the confident sway of her movements, the quickness of her laugh, or the way she made direct eye contact just long enough to make someone feel seen. To her nearly 40,000 followers, Sienna Blake was aspiration incarnate, glamorous, free-spirited, and successful. She seemed to embody modern perfection, someone who lived boldly and unapologetically. But what her followers didn't know was that Sienna's life was a construction, an art form she perfected over time, where reality had been buried beneath layers of filtered lies. Behind the veneer of curated luxury, Sienna was a woman driven by something far less romantic: control and survival. She had a talent, one that she used ruthlessly: the ability to read people. She could spot insecurity, loneliness, or ambition within minutes of meeting someone. And she knew how to become the exact person they needed to see. To Ryan Morgan, Sienna was soft and vulnerable, a woman who longed for quiet simplicity after a lifetime of chasing empty dreams. Her skill lay in her adaptability. For Ryan, who lived a life of caution and isolation, Sienna became the bright spark in his otherwise monotonous existence. She knew how to play to his insecurities, presenting herself as a woman in search of stability, someone tired of the chaotic world she had once inhabited. Her stories were crafted with precision, a tale of a glamorous life that had grown hollow, of loneliness disguised by luxury. She told Ryan she longed for the normalcy he took for granted, the safety of quiet nights, shared meals, and love built on trust, and Ryan believed her. To the world outside, however, Sienna was far from longing for simplicity. She navigated multiple relationships at once, her life a delicate balancing act. For men like Grant Hayes, she was untouchable, mysterious and glamorous, the kind of woman who always seemed just out of reach. Sienna let Grant believe he was chasing her, dangling promises of exclusivity, while encouraging him to shower her with gifts and opportunities. Luxury handbags, boutique hotels, and extravagant dinners weren't indulgences for Sienna. They were tools. Tools that told the world she was someone worth admiring. Then there was David Cross, a Ridgewood businessman with aspirations of higher social standing. David prided himself on his polished image, but deep down, he was insecure. A man whose success came at the cost of personal fulfillment. Sienna saw him for what he was, lonely and vulnerable. To David, she became a source of inspiration, someone who saw him as more than his title or bank account. She fed his ego while subtly extracting what she needed: connections, financial support, and invitations to places that opened new doors. Each relationship served a purpose, and Sienna maintained the facade with chilling efficiency. She remembered the details that mattered: the way Grant liked his steaks medium rare, the childhood nickname David had confessed during a vulnerable moment, and the exact words Ryan used to describe his fear of being alone forever. Her charm was her greatest weapon, and she wielded it with precision, always careful to keep her truths just out of reach. But Sienna's life was not without cracks. Keeping so many threads untangled required effort, and as the months went on, her ability to maintain the lies began to fray. There were late-night calls she couldn't explain, gifts she forgot to hide, and stories that changed just slightly when she retold them. To a man like Ryan, whose nature was to observe and analyze, these inconsistencies became seeds of suspicion. It was small things at first. Sienna's phone was always face down, its screen lighting up late into the night with texts she never acknowledged. When he'd ask, she'd wave it off with a breezy, "Work stuff. You know how it is." There were late-night calls where she'd step into another room, her voice low, as though shielding something. And then there were the absences, hours unaccounted for, with vague explanations about influencer meetings or business opportunities. The first real red flag came in the form of a credit card bill. Ryan had opened it absent-mindedly one evening, only to find unfamiliar charges: a luxury hotel in Portland, a boutique clothing purchase totaling hundreds of dollars, and an upscale restaurant neither of them had visited. When he confronted her, Sienna laughed it off, her tone light and dismissive. "Relax, Ryan," she said, leaning against the kitchen counter. "Those are for collaborations. I told you, I'm building my brand. These things are investments." Ryan tried to believe her. He wanted to, he needed to. But the unease gnawed at him, a pit of doubt he couldn't shake. The final fracture came on a cold evening in early November. Sienna had left her laptop open on his dining table while she showered, and Ryan glanced at the screen without meaning to. An email sat open, the subject line innocuous, but it was the closing line that made Ryan's heart drop. "Can't wait to spend the weekend with you, love. Suites booked. Grant." The name Grant Hayes registered immediately. Sienna had mentioned him once or twice. A nightclub owner she claimed was just a business contact. But this email was not about business. Ryan felt his chest tighten as the pieces began falling into place. The absences, the late-night calls, the hotel charges, it all made sense now. That night, Ryan confronted her. Sienna's facade crumbled under the weight of the evidence. Her sweet, easy demeanor turned sharp, her voice cold and accusatory. She called him paranoid, told him he didn't understand her world. But Ryan saw it clearly now: the cracks in her mask, the icy calculation beneath the charm. When he walked out of her apartment that night, his heart was pounding, his mind a storm of anger, confusion, and heartbreak. It was the last time he would ever see her alive. Detective Maria Dawson had seen her fair share of tangled cases in her 20 years on the force. But Sienna Blake's murder felt like a different beast entirely. It wasn't the brutality of the act or the mysterious circumstances that set it apart. It was the people involved, the lives interwoven like threads pulled too tight until they finally snapped. Sienna had spun a web of deception, and now Dawson was tasked with untangling the knots, one painstaking piece at a time. From the outset, Ryan Morgan seemed like the logical suspect. The boyfriend, emotionally fragile and angry after their final confrontation, with no clear alibi. When questioned, Ryan admitted to driving around Ridgewood late into the night, his mind in turmoil, unable to process the realization that Sienna, the woman who had brought color into his life, had betrayed him. To Dawson, his story felt genuine, his eyes hollow with grief and disbelief. Yet, a shaky alibi was still a shaky alibi. And the press quickly painted Ryan as a scorned lover who'd been pushed too far. But Dawson wasn't satisfied. The crime scene nagged at her, the precision of it, the half-concealed car, the lack of defensive wounds. It was too clean, too hastily staged. Ryan Morgan didn't strike her as a man capable of such cold calculation. He was unraveling, yes, but the pieces didn't quite fit. The breakthrough came from surveillance footage. Dawson's team combed through grainy recordings from local businesses and street cameras, finally striking gold. At 11:43 p.m., a black SUV was spotted pulling into Ridgewood from the interstate. Its route matched the area around Silver Pine Lake where Sienna's body had been found. The vehicle's license plate was traced back to Grant Hayes, the flashy nightclub owner with a history of extravagant spending and a reputation for volatile relationships. Dawson wasted no time. Grant Hayes was brought in for questioning. At first he was smug, the kind of man used to buying his way out of trouble. He stuck to his story. He'd been in Portland for a business deal the night Sienna died. But the evidence told a different tale. The tire tracks at the scene were a perfect match for his SUV, and phone records placed him in Ridgewood at the time of the murder. Grant cracked. His composure shattered like Sienna's phone under the passenger seat. In a low, broken voice, he confessed. He admitted he'd driven to Ridgewood that night after learning that Sienna, his Sienna, had been seeing other men, a discovery that felt like a slap to his ego. When he arrived at her apartment, she refused to let him in, so he waited, following her when she finally left in her white BMW. At the gravel path near Silver Pine Lake, he confronted her. Their argument turned ugly. Grant demanded answers. Who were the other men? Why had she lied to him? But Sienna, ever the manipulator, hadn't cowered under his anger. Instead, she laughed, a cruel, cutting sound that Grant said still echoed in his head. She mocked him, told him he was no different than the others, another man who'd bought into her act. In a blind rage, Grant grabbed her wrist, pulling her out of the car. She tried to break free, and in the chaos, her head struck the edge of the doorframe. The blow had been sudden and fatal. Realizing what he'd done, Grant panicked. He staged the scene as best he could, shoving the phone under the seat and attempting to hide the car with fallen branches before speeding back to Portland, leaving Ridgewood and Sienna behind. In the courtroom, the truth unraveled further. Testimonies revealed the full extent of Sienna's manipulations. Men came forward, men who had once thought themselves special, only to realize they were pawns in her carefully orchestrated game. Each man had been promised something different: love, exclusivity, admiration. Grant Hayes wasn't the only one. Ridgewood businessman David Cross admitted to funding Sienna's business ventures, only to discover she had fabricated deals and kept the money for herself. Others spoke of the same charm, the same promises, and the same cold indifference once Sienna had gotten what she needed. For Ryan Morgan, the trial was an exercise in painful clarity. He sat in the back of the courtroom, listening as the woman he had loved was described as manipulative, cunning, and cruel. The realization was devastating. He had fallen in love with a person who never truly existed. Sienna had been a mirror, reflecting back whatever someone wanted to see. And Ryan, desperate for connection, had believed her version of him, the man who could rescue her from her so-called past. When the trial concluded, Grant Hayes was sentenced to 25 years for second-degree murder. Ridgewood, still reeling from the scandal, settled back into its quiet rhythm, but nothing felt quite the same. The story of Sienna Blake became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered at coffee shops and dinner tables. A stark reminder that behind carefully curated appearances, darkness often lurked. Sienna Blake's story was not just a tale of murder. It was a tragedy of broken trust, selfish ambition, and lives unraveled in pursuit of fleeting dreams. Behind every whispered promise, behind every perfect smile, there had been a void, a darkness that swallowed everyone who came too close. And in the end, everyone, Ryan, Grant, and Ridgewood itself, paid the price for it.